All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the final talk in our series on the ethics and politics of food, featuring Guelph researchers working on that broad theme. This final talk is going to be presented by Lauren Sneyd in geography, Evan Fraser in geography, and another contributor is Jennifer Van Steenkist, who is in Haiti doing research, and I believe we have a short clip that she just sent to us from the other day. And the title is The Causes of Food Riots in Haiti and Cameroon, Empirical Evidence and Accounts from the 2008 Food Protests. So please join me in welcoming Lauren and Evan.
Thanks, guys, and thanks, Monique, for the opportunity. This is all new stuff. So normally I'm a good environmentalist, and I recycle. My talks, pretty much everything. But this one is actually new because it doesn't involve me doing the work. It involves Lauren and Jen doing the work, which means we've actually got new material to talk about, which I'm very excited about. So what we've got is me being the typical supervisor. I will set the stage, do the big sort of 10,000 mile high overview of the topic. And then for the actual hard work and the real results and the real new data, I'm going to pass the torch over to Lauren. And we're going to try to sound authoritative about all of our results, including the stuff on Haiti. Although if any of you know anything about Haiti and ask us any questions, we will simply hand you Jennifer's email address. And she can answer the questions on Haiti, although we will put on a brave face and pretend as if we know what we're talking about. So to start, and to give you the sort of the context setting bit of the talk, I'd invite you to look at these two photographs. They came from an Institute for Development Studies bulletin. Institute for Development Studies is based at the University of Sussex in the UK, as many of you will know. And this came out a couple years ago. And I'd like you to look first at the photo on the left, which was taken on in a market in the African nation of Zambia in early 2008. And it shows how much food you could buy for $1, $1 Canadian dollar. And we've got some starches, some green leafy vegetables, some tomatoes, what I imagine is either cooking oil or cooking fuel, I'm not quite sure, and some onions, and then a little bag of dried fish, which would be the supply of protein. The photograph on the right was taken in the same market about 1 year later, and it shows you how much you could buy at that date for $1 Canadian dollar. And you'll see the protein supply has vanished. There's a lot less food. And of course, what happened in between these two photographs being taken was skyrocketing food prices. A crisis, arguably, that has thrown tens, if not hundreds of millions of people deeper into poverty. And we get a sense of the sort of nutritional impact of this crisis in these two photographs. Of course, this crisis isn't just about nutrition and poverty, it also is about politics. And what we've got here is a map put together for us by the war journalist Gwyn Dyer. And the countries that Gwyn Dyer has identified in the red are countries where between 2008 and 2011 there were food riots, people taking to the streets in violent protest, outraged over the price of their daily bread. And the media on these food riots has given us some really interesting images. So we've got from Cameroon here, the riot police coming down the street, a protester armed with a French baguette, reminding me a little bit of that old Monty Python sketch with the banana. Come on, be as vicious as you like. We've got images like this, which was taken in Egypt at the beginning moments of the Arab Spring, which actually started over protests over the price of bread. And we get the French baguette, perhaps echoing the French Revolution and Marie Antoinette's comment about cake, symbolizing the crisis at hand. So in 2010, when I arrived at Guelph, Lauren and I struck up a conversation about these things. We got quite interested about these things. And the first thing we did is we turned to the media to start thinking about, well, what exactly is the link between a rising price of food and an event like this, a protest in the streets? And we have to remember that for the most part, the world's 800 or so million hungry people suffer in silence. So there's got to be something going on that actually triggers a protest or a food riot. And so here's just a sample of what the media says. As we know, these kinds of questions about food prices, sometimes end in war. A hungry man is an angry man. Another article reports, when food prices rise and people have nothing to lose, they lose it. Nothing sends a person into the streets quite like an empty stomach. I think you'll find a seat right about there. So you have to walk right through the middle of the audience to sit down. What we get out of the media is this sort of narrative of desperation and poverty, that this rising price of food causes people to lose assets and become desperate, and desperation triggers the hunger. And this sort of narrative has had huge implications for policy. So senior level policymakers have taken this intuitively obvious argument and based their policy recommendations around it. So just to give you a sample of that, here we've got Jeffrey Sachs, arguably the world's most important development economist right now. I can see Sally smirking a little bit here. Arguably. Well, when asked what he would do about the food crisis or what we can do to stop this crisis from happening, what we can do to stop riots, he says this: a better harvest this year and an easing of trade barriers will help end the food crisis. So here we see this argument about desperation, political unrest, and the solution is more food and more trade. Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, says something very similar when asked about the causes of the crisis. Defensive trade policies contributed very substantially to the increase in world food prices of staple crops in the 2008 food crisis. Again, an argument about trade and the volume of food. And my third example is Kalestos Juma, a Harvard development expert, writing in the journal Nature, not a bad place to get an editorial landed, where he writes this: to survive the droughts, wars, and other major causes of famine, Africa must embrace technologies that enable it to produce more, better food with less effort. Yeah, writing so that was in 2011. And so Lauren and I are sort of discerning, and gender discerning, is that we've got this sort of strong narrative bubbling up that links these price rises to protests based on this idea of desperation, and that the solution then is more food, more trade, and more technology. When you start drilling into the data, though, some cracks start emerging in this narrative, or this argument. So initially, if you start looking at price data, which is what I'll reveal in just a second, things seem to conform to this description that I'm telling you about. So we've got the UN's Food Price Index, which is a weighted average of commodities and food groups, giving us a snapshot at a point in time of how much food costs. Data for the UN's Food Price Index goes back to the year 1990, and when we see the data unfold, that's the result. Flat, stable prices up till about 2007, and then these two dramatic spikes with, which coincided with these riots, and then sort of a decline since then. Fair enough, maybe Kalestos and Jeffrey and Rob Zoellick, maybe they're right. But then you start thinking, well, isn't food supposed to be, or price supposed to be a reflection of supply and demand? So let's see what's looking to supply over this time. And let's look at supply measured in kilocalories per person per day, which I think we can probably agree is a sensible way of measuring how much food we've got. And at the beginning of this time series, 1990, there was actually 2,600 kilocalories per person per day on the planet. And this is what the data looks like as it unfolds. Unfortunately, the last year for which data is available is the end of 2009, so we don't have it. But we've got availability throughout the first of these two crises. And I'd say there's a couple points that we need to bring home. First of all, at the end of this period of time, there was 2,800 calories per person per day. In other words, there's enough food for everybody on the planet. Secondly, the supply is very steady. The price is zigzagging all over the place. So I think we have to question whether or not the crisis, as reflected in price, is really a function of supply, and is trade and increasing supply even going to do anything to stop this crisis? So to dig into this issue in a little bit more detail, I did some really fancy GIS, and this is before I knew Krishna. Krishna is the postdoc working with us on GIS, and he's a little embarrassed by me showing these slides, but my fancy GIS skills allowed me to say, let's look at Gwynne Dyer's map of food riots, and let's look at a map of poverty, and let's just simply see if they match up. And indeed, they really don't match up. We got reasonably wealthy countries that had food riots, like Mexico. We had quite wealthy countries in Eastern Europe which had food riots. We've got some poor countries, like countries in the west part of South America, that had food riots. And we've got really poor countries in Africa that didn't have food riots. So you start questioning whether or not this whole narrative makes any sense at all. And if we increase food and increase trade, is that going to do anything about this at all? So I then have to introduce another protagonist in our little research team, and that's Alexander sitting over there. And Alex grew up in Cameroon and did his PhD in geography and started talking to us about this as well. And we've got other papers that involve Alex explicitly. And one of the first things I did is I went to Alex and his brother-in-law, and I said, well, you saw the riots. You know people that were engaged or involved or peripherally in the problems in Cameroon. What caused them? And to be honest, this was a few years ago. I was expecting to hear, well, we got hungry, food got scarce, prices rose, and we got desperate, or the people in the markets got desperate. But Alex's brother-in-law said something very different. He said the riots were caused when a group of merchants were found to be taking advantage of everyone. The merchants are cutthroat business guys who don't give a damn about people. So this is an argument about moral anger and outrage. It's not about hunger and desperation. It's a very different story. And if this story is right, if this is the trigger of riots, then the policy implications are completely different. And Calestis Juma and Jeffrey Sachs and Robert Zelek's prescriptions will not work. So this then led us, Alex, Lauren, myself, Jen, to ask a couple of questions. What are the causes of food riots? How does a price spike lead to civil unrest? And in this particular case, the paper that Lauren and I are presenting today, we decided we would do this as a comparative study of two countries, Cameroon and Haiti, that both experienced bad riots. And they were bad riots that were depicted regularly in the media as food crises, as a manifestation of the food crisis. So then, just before I turn over to Lauren, the way we approached this problem was to adopt a framework that started with Chin and Middleman's 1997 framework that talks about elements of riots. And then we sort of added and subtracted and multiplied and divided on this basic framework to come up with 6 basic categories that we would then question people in these two countries to see if we could make some sense of. So first of all, we wanted to find out something about the background context. What background socio-political factors contributed to the food riot? What was the form of resistance? Was it a strike, a protest over food, a protest over fuel? What actual form did the protest take? Third component was the agents. Who were the protesters in terms of their demographic makeup, etc.? The sites of resistance. Where did the protest take place? Were they in highly public spaces? Were they in marketplaces? Were they in government buildings? Where did they take place? And can we read something about the causes of the riots into the sites? What sort of strategies did protesters use? And finally, what was the outcomes of it? And we figured that if we talked to people on the ground in these two countries, asking them questions along these 6 headings, we might come up with some better understanding of the causes of riots and therefore have some anticipation of what sort of policies might address this problem. So with that being said, Lauren and I are going to do a quick turnover of the mic, which I will extract from my pocket and unpin from my shirt. There we go. And Lauren will, while she gets kitted up, we'll talk through the specific methodologies, a bit more about the details of the sites we used, and then talk us through the results, and then I'll jump back in for the last few minutes and talk about the implications.
Conclusions and wrap up, yep. Thanks, Evan. So I'm going to, like Evan said, I'm going to talk today about our methods and kind of our results, the empirical evidence that kind of informs our conclusions. So for these case studies, we used mixed methods, including a review of media sources, reports from civil society, multilateral and bilateral organizations, and academic studies. We also did in-country fieldwork and interviews in these different markets throughout the countries. So we started by gathering GIS points from these markets to kind of map the markets in the exact locations where we were conducting these surveys and interviews. So for our study, we relied on semi-structured questionnaires that were just changed slightly in each country to reflect the local market names and to address local cultural sensitivities. So research on food riots at this time, like Evan was saying, really focused on analyzing news media and to try and get at, the causes of food riots from this very high level kind of analysis from this international perspective.